Thank you so much, Sue. Thank you very much for this introduction. So, yeah, so it's my pleasure to introduce the keynote speaker for today's conference, Dr. Denise Hines, my colleague and friend. So Denise Hines is an associate professor in the Department of Social Work at George Mason University in the United States. She's the former director of the Massachusetts Family Impact Seminar Series and co-founder of the Clark Anti-Violence Educational Program. Denise Hines is a widely published international expert on intimate partner violence and specifically on men's victimization and men's experiences of intimate partner violence. She's the author and co-author of over 70 publications and book chapters and 3 books published by Sage on the issues of family violence. She has also been a principal investigator on, now it's probably not 6, but more, major grants, totaling more with $4 million US, focusing on issues of etiology of domestic violence, prevention of dating violence, sexual assault, stalking on college campuses, mental and physical health of male victims of intimate partner violence. Dr. Hines has connections with over 1,000 US-based male victims and relevant stakeholders in the United States and other Western countries. In 2010, Denise Hines became the only female scholar to make the top 10 most productive scholars as determined by the American Psychological Association's journal, Psychology of Men and Masculinity. She has been an invited keynote speaker, panelist, guest expert at many conferences, workshops, radio, and TV programs. So please welcome Dr. Hines.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you. Thank you all for coming. Thank you for that wonderful introduction, Sasha. Oh, and that'll be helpful. Okay.
At the beginning.
And thank you to the organizing committee for inviting me here to present my work on male partner violence victimization. I'm thrilled to be here. I haven't been in person at a conference in 4 years. So it's exciting to see people again I haven't seen in a long time, to meet people I've only met on Zoom, and to make new connections. So I'm really excited to share with you my work on men's partner violence victimization. There's actually some new data I'm going to be presenting today. It's a first reveal of it, so really excited to get some feedback on that and your impressions of it. And how am I advancing the slides?
I will be doing it.
Oh, I have to say next slide, please. Okay. So next slide, please. So I want to just start out first by acknowledging some of my colleagues. So Emily Douglas, if you know my work, you know her name. She and I submitted our first grant proposal together in 2005. We've known each other since 2003. I don't know how many of those 70 publications have been with Emily Douglas. So she's very much my partner in crime on this work, and unfortunately was not able to attend this conference. And then I also want to acknowledge the collaborators on the new data that I'll be presenting today. They're from all over the world. 2 of them are here today. One is Sasha Masova, and Liz Bates is somewhere in the audience. Oh, right over there. And this is their first time seeing this data too, so exciting for them. Next slide, please. And then also to the research assistants at George Mason University who have helped with collecting the data, managing the data. They're still coding the qualitative data. So I won't be presenting any of that today, but they have been instrumental in getting the study off the ground. Next slide, please. And then my funders. So I'll be talking about some of my older work, which was funded by the National Institutes of Mental Health and National Institute of Child Health and Human Development, which are arms of the National Institutes of Health in the United States. And then my new study was funded internally by George Mason University's College of Health and Human Development. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so finally, the substance of my work. So what do we know? Well, as many of you know, we've known for a very long time, for hundreds of years that men can be victims of intimate partner violence. The research data has been showing it for about 50 years now. So in the early 1970s, Richard Gellis, he published his dissertation, I believe it was his dissertation, in a book called The Violent Home. And that was the first, as far as I know, the first documentation of some data on men's partner violence victimization. And he didn't really talk too much about it in the book. He actually focused more on the violence against wives in the book. It was focused on marriages. But he did mention that about half of all the partner violence victims in his study were men. And then in 1975, we had the first National Family Violence Survey in the United States, which Richard Gellis did with his mentor, Murray Strauss. Unfortunately, both of them have since passed away. But they found, again, actually, I don't remember how many were, hundreds of folks in the first National Family Violence Survey who were in heterosexual marriages. About half of all partner violence victims were men. And they published this information because it was scientific findings and we should know about this. They did actually hypothesize that most of this was probably in self-defense or retaliation, but they thought this needs a little extra research. We want to learn what's going on here. In 1978, their colleague published the article, The Battered Husband Syndrome. So Suzanne Steinmetz used data from the first National Family Violence Survey and published that particular article, which received a lot of backlash, but she made the argument that there's probably a group of men who are battered in the same way that women were battered. And then in 1985, they did the National Family Violence Survey over again. 10 years later, found the same thing. About half of all partner violence victims were men. And this time they actually asked, in the last physical argument, who instigated it first? And about half the time it was the female partner by both men and women's accounts. And so they said, this is something we need to look into more. There's something going on here. And they received a lot of backlash, as many of you might know, from doing this work and from publishing these findings. So there were letters written to have their tenure and their federal funding revoked. One of them was accused publicly of sexually harassing his students and beating his wife. Suzanne Steinmetz, her daughter, she was getting married and a bomb threat was called into her wedding. And they regularly had their talks picketed. Murray sometimes joked about having food thrown at him during his talks. So, this was something that received a lot of backlash. Previous slide, please. Still not done with it. So it received a lot of backlash just for publishing their scientific findings. But these findings were found dozens and dozens of times over again. And in 2000, John Archer published a meta-analysis. And his meta-analysis was on gender differences in partner violence. And he found again about equal rates of partner violence by men and women against men and women. And still a lot of backlash, still a lot of arguing, still a lot of saying, well, women must be doing it in self-defense or retaliation. There's been a lot of studies in the meantime showing that women's motives for partner violence are very similar to men's motives in partner violence, to show anger, they're jealous, they are having trouble expressing their emotions verbally. They're retaliating for emotional hurt, so on and so forth. There is self-defense and retaliation, but it tends to be a little lower on the list. So next slide, please. And so these studies have been done time and again. Archer's meta-analysis was 22 years ago, and we're seeing these findings again and again and again. Even our best population-based studies are showing that anywhere between 1/3 and 50% of partner violence victims in a given year are men. So in Australia and England and Wales, they show about 1/3 of partner violence victims are men. In Canada and the United States, for example, it's between 40 to 50% of partner violence victims are men. And it just depends on how it's defined or how it's measured, but we're seeing this time and time again. So we've known for 50 years that men can be victims of partner violence at rates higher than what most people think. And we've known it for a long time, but nobody else seems to know it, right? Like I teach my students this and they're surprised. I tell my friends at cocktail parties what I do and they're surprised. But they all seem to know someone, don't they?
Yeah.
Like, oh yeah, like I have this friend, right? They all seem to know someone. So next slide, please. So why doesn't anybody know this? Well, I think I don't have to tell you why nobody knows this, but the dominant theory to explain partner violence has traditionally been patriarchal theory, which assumes that the underlying cause of domestic violence is men's need to maintain the patriarchal structure of society, whereby men need to maintain their dominance and control over women. And the patriarchal theory sort of originated with the women's movement, and in a sense, it was wonderful in that it brought this idea of partner violence out of the home and into the public eye, and really started to make folks pay attention to this issue. It had not been paid attention to before, right? So people were paying attention, and they had this enormous grassroots efforts where, at least in the United States, there's well over 2,000 domestic violence agencies. We have better intervention programs, which are not very effective, but there are also thousands of those. There's policies and laws now. So they just brought this out in the public eye, but they were not very flexible in changing the underlying theory when new evidence was presented. And so it has impacted practice and policy. All of those domestic violence agencies were developed under the notion that this is something that men do to women. Better intervention programs have the underlying theory that this is something that men do to women because of patriarchal issues. Now, research has been a little bit more flexible because we're supposed to be open to being falsifiable. And so we do try, you will see more and more researchers who take a broader perspective and are willing to change their perspectives with new evidence. But there are researchers who do maintain a patriarchal perspective. So, for example, Evan Stark, as recently as 2010, talked about how women's violence within relationships was essentially due to them wanting to break out of their oppressive stature in their relationships. So they were below their male partners, and so fighting back physically was their way of gaining equality in their relationships. And he also made the argument that there is no need for any sort of domestic violence services for men because it's not consequential in any way. Michael Johnson has tried to toe the line between the findings of these big population-based surveys and other surveys that show that half of partner violence victims are men, and then the other theoretical perspective of patriarchal theory. So he came up with a typology in 1995, arguing that there's actually two types of partner violence. One is situational couple violence, and that's what we're seeing in those big population-based surveys. And so these are couples where arguments are getting out of hand, and sometimes to the point where one partner uses violence against other. It's typically low-level violence, doesn't cause too many injuries, and it's not within any sort of pattern of controlling the other partner. And he said that's what you're seeing in those surveys. And men and women do that equally. And he said, but intimate terrorism is something you're not seeing in those surveys because this is really dysfunctional, terroristic violence. They're not participating in those population-based surveys. This is where men are using violence and control in order to maintain dominance over women. And so you see lots of controlling behaviors, often with severe violence, many injuries, severe psychological abuse, and it is in this pattern of control and power, and it can be, he says, explained by patriarchal theory. So in his theoretical perspective, all violence by women against men would be relegated to situational couple violence, and all violence within LGBTQ relationships would also be relegated into situational couple violence. And we know that that's not true. We know that sampling biases are one of the things that's causing him to think intimate terrorism is solely perpetrated by men against women. That if you do look, you will see intimate terrorism by women against men. The Canadian General Social Survey is an excellent example of where you see intimate terrorism not only in population-based surveys, but you see about 40% of its victims are men. So, and just also as an aside, in his 2008 book, Michael Johnson said that women's use of aggression is a quaint form of feminine communication, which I actually find pretty offensive. So, yeah, that my legitimate sources of anger and aggression is quaint and cute. So next slide, please. So I got tired of this arguing. I got tired of this argument when I was a graduate student in the 1990s. And so I said, let's stop arguing about relative prevalence and all of this stuff and making unsupported hypotheses that no one's ever bothered testing. And let's just find out what's going on in these relationships where men are saying, this is happening to me and it's consequential, it's impactful. So I said, why don't we just ask the men? So yes, thank you. So I wrote an article. This is my very first one. And I basically said, we need to assess men who are in these relationships where they're saying there's a lot of partner violence against them. And we need to look at their mental health. We need to assess what's going on here. And next one. And after reading that article, Jan Brown called me. And I don't know if any of you know Jan Brown or have heard of her, but she started the one and only hotline in the United States called the Domestic Abuse Hotline for Men that served male victims. And I use the past tense because it doesn't exist anymore. She could never get funding for it. So about 10 years ago, she could no longer sustain it and it doesn't exist anymore. But anyway, she had a few hundred calls a month from men that she helped to support in whatever way she could. And she said to me, I have these call logs. I'd love for you to analyze them. So I did. And so some of you do know this article, Characteristics of Callers, the Domestic Abuse Helpline for Men. And it was the first real good, solid look at what these men were reporting in their relationships. And it was the basis for a grant proposal that Emily Douglas and I, next slide, that we submitted to the NIH in 2005. It was finally funded in 2007 to look specifically at male victims' abuse experiences, their help-seeking experiences, and their mental health. And to our knowledge, it was the first ever federally funded study in any country that focused on male victims' partner violence. So we were really excited we got this opportunity. Murray Strauss actually told me you should include women in your grant proposal to get it funded, and I said I didn't want to. So I'm glad I didn't. And we did a good job on this study. And so we got funded again, next slide, in 2013. And in 2013, we were funded by Child Health and Human Development arm of the NIH. So we can look at further mental health issues and look at the children, the child witnesses and their mental health. And so what did we learn? Next slide. Well, what did we learn? What did we learn from those studies? We learned a lot. One thing that surprised even us was that men's experiences of abuse in our samples mirrored what we were seeing in samples of battered women. We didn't know it would be that bad, but it was pretty bad things that we were seeing among these men. And so we were seeing very similar levels of physical abuse, similar rates and frequencies of physical abuse, similar rates and frequencies of controlling behaviors and severe psychological abuse, which is what Michael Johnson would call intimate terrorism. we were seeing it. We also saw sexual abuse. In our second study, we did a pretty good assessment of their sexual abuse experiences. And we really wanted to do this because one of the critiques about male victimization is, oh, they really can't have it so bad because they're not going to be sexually abused. Well, we found that over a quarter of the men reported being physically forced to engage in sexual intercourse, and that over 40% were reporting some kind of sexual abuse in their relationships. So it's a little bit lower than what you would see in samples of battered women, but similar to samples of battered women, what we found was that it was indicative of much more dangerous relationships, that men who were in relationships where there was also sexual abuse had more severe violence going on. And we also found that it was a significant independent predictor of poor mental health. We also saw that their clinical levels of PTSD symptoms were similar to what we would see in samples of battered women. They were reporting being injured at pretty similar rates to battered women. And the abuse impacted both their mental health and their physical health, so both PTSD and depression. And for physical health, we looked at their self-reported physical health, but also any doctor, what they reported as doctor diagnoses of cardiovascular diseases. So it did impact their cardiovascular health too. Next slide. And so here are some of the things that they're saying. We have a lot of quotes of men. It's really hard to narrow it down to 5, but this just gives you a flavor of some of the things they were reporting on. So I have scars from my head down. I have 30 burn marks, had a gun pointed at my head, was pushed down a flight of stairs and was beaten up. You know, obviously that's not situational couple violence. She controls who we see, who I talk to, what I do with my time, and all our money. I have to hand her my checks. I have been sexually abused by my former spouse in a variety of ways, typically while I was sleeping. And just as an aside, one of the ways that women perpetrators do kind of equalize any sort of strength differentials is that they attack during situations of vulnerability, like when you're sleeping or taking a shower or some other way that you're vulnerable. So this man says, I have PVPS, which she would use to denigrate me for not wanting sex. This caused significant pain during sex. Any resistance would cause her to become violent. The last 8 months we were together, I was having severe heart attack symptoms. Some mornings I would wake up and half my body would be numb. I often went to sleep hoping I wouldn't wake up, but I couldn't leave her because I was afraid for my children. Remember that quote for the next slide. During our relationship, I fell into a deep state of deep depression and experienced suicidal ideation. And this last quote, she said she was calling the police. I said, fine, she did. They arrested me with no proof or evidence of me doing anything. They dropped charges, but not before a 6-month restraining order on me, which I can't read the bottom there. I think it said something along the lines of, thank you, destroyed my family and business, all based on her false allegations. Next slide, please. So those last 2 quotes get into some other things that we have learned. Legal administrative abuse. So we were finding through reviews of the literature and some qualitative work, particularly some qualitative work out of Australia, and some of the things that men were reporting in our study, that they were complaining a lot about false allegations of abusing their spouses, abusing their children, having restraining orders filed against them under false pretenses, having their reputation ruined in their community, workplace, et cetera. And so we decided to initially develop a scale and test it. And we did see a lot of legal administrative abuse. And we also saw that it was a significant predictor of their poor mental health and the poor mental health of their children. We also learned why they don't just leave. Unlike that man on the previous slide, they're not leaving mostly because of their children, right? So one of the critiques, another critique of the existence of male victims was, well, they can just get up and leave. They're not as dependent on their relationships as women are. And we found, well, the men are not just getting up and leaving because they want to stay for the children. And there's a variety of reasons for that. One is they're afraid they're going to lose custody of their kids in court. And so they're not going to see their kids very much. And if they do get some visitation in court, their ex-wives will block any sort of visitation in an attempt to further control them. Or their wife is also violent against the children. So if he leaves and risks not getting custody, there's no one there to protect them from a violent mother. So very legitimate reasons for not leaving. They also don't leave because they're committed to the marriage and they love their partners. So that's also a big reason for not leaving, is wanting to protect her, wanting to make her better, hoping she'll change, loving her and being committed to the marriage. You see that a lot among battered women as well. And there are other barriers too, like financial barriers, or she threatens suicide, or things like that that prevent him from leaving. And we see similar barriers to help seeking. So both internal and external barriers to help seeking. So some internal barriers were that, shame and embarrassment, not knowing where to go, never even thinking that what's happening to me is domestic violence. So what would I do? We hear a lot of, well, there was nothing that I needed. She needed mental health help. I didn't need anything. So not realizing that he needed help, or that he was being victimized by domestic violence. And a lot of issues about, us men need to handle this ourselves. This is not something that can happen to a man. All of those things, all of those stereotypes that we have about domestic violence and masculinity. And then there were a lot of external barriers. So one major external barrier was nowhere to go, right? So we don't have, or we haven't traditionally had too many agencies that would support male victims. And the men in our study would go to certain places and get turned away. So they would go to mainstream domestic violence agencies, for example, and 2/3 of them found this not at all helpful, usually because they were told they only help women. They were told he must have done something to deserve it. They were told he must be the real batterer. They were actually made fun of sometimes, and their experiences were made light of. And similar things happened when they tried to contact the police. And as a matter of fact, when they contacted the police in our study, they were just as likely to be arrested as she was. So lots of barriers to seeking help. Next slide, please. But good news, well, what we hoped was good news. So after we published all of this work, and remember our second grant was in 2000, what did I say? 13. Thank you, 13. And our first grant, which most of that help seeking study was done on, was in 2007. We were getting, both Emily Douglas and I were getting a lot of calls. And we both had done trainings of domestic violence agencies, of domestic violence coalitions. We've been called to help people learn how to serve male victims. And so a few years ago, I think it was like right before the pandemic or at the beginning of the pandemic, Emily and I were talking and we said, maybe things have changed and we can't rely on this 2007 help seeking data anymore. We need to figure out what's going on here. So next slide, please. So these are some of the things that we saw had changed. We saw outreach with photos of men on it. This is actually less than a mile from my house where my kids take swim lessons. And my husband was wondering why I was stopped at the elevator taking a picture. I'm like, there's this domestic violence poster. I have to take a picture of it. So faces of men on outreach. Next slide. Outreach specific to men, right? Next slide. Shelters opening up for men. So this is one in the United States. I didn't have a similar one for the wonderful one that's opened in Canada over a year ago by the Canadian Center for Men's and Family, but some shelters opening up, more services available. Next slide, please. Lots of newspaper coverage. We were getting called by journalists. I was on a talk show. Like who knew that people were this interested or knew that this was happening? Next slide, please. And then Emily participated in this particular roundtable in the United States by the Family Violence Prevention Services Program in 2018, wanting to enhance services for male survivors. Next slide. And then during the pandemic, not the best picture of Emily and me, but we did this webinar for the National National Resource Center on Domestic Violence in the United States. Hundreds of domestic violence service providers attended this webinar on serving male victims. So we thought maybe things are changing. And so we did design a study that we launched in 2021 with all those folks that were on that original slide. Next slide, please. And since then, we've had the Johnny Depp trial, which was right down the street from where I work. And I was really upset that I was not an expert witness. But anyway, Johnny Depp can afford me, believe me. But this brought out the issue of domestic violence against men, right? Like the Pirate of the Caribbean can be a victim of domestic violence. Men are not alone, and maybe they can start getting better help. Now, this won't be reflected in the data that we collected because we shut down data collection before the Johnny Depp trial, but it does show that this is getting more press. Next slide, please. So what did the data show? Well, this was a 2021 study, so a survey study from February to December of 2021. And we assessed men in any English-speaking country. So it's not just the United States like much of my previous work, which is why we had folks from around the world. We also assessed anyone who identified as a man. So it could be a trans man as well, and men of any sexual orientation. And so we recruited them through online advertisements, social media platforms. You know, the folks that were involved had lots of connections, and we were able to recruit that way. And we recruited men who experienced aggression from their romantic partners. And the questions that I'll be focusing on today come from the conflict tactics scales, which we supplemented with measures to assess controlling behaviors and legal administrative abuse. And we also have an enhanced version of our 2007 help seeking scale, where we assessed 14 different types of places they could seek help from, what their experiences were like if they sought help from them. And then Sasha had the wonderful idea of adding a questionnaire of if they didn't seek help there, why not? And I believe that came from the Canadian General Social Survey. Yeah, so the tick marks for why they didn't seek help, we used from the Canadian General Social Survey, and we tailored it to each source of helping. And that's a lot of the data I'll be presenting today. So thank you, Sasha. Yes, next slide, please. So we had 601 men complete the survey. And I'm going to be focusing on the 510 men who reported violence within the past 5 years to just get a current sense of their help-seeking efforts. Next slide. In the interest of time, I'm going to breeze through the demographics, but 2/3 were from the United States, followed by Australia, England, and Canada. Most of the men were cisgender men. 85.6% of the men were heterosexual. Next slide. So similarly, 86.5% of their partners were women. In terms of the types of relationships, they could check all that apply. So these are raw numbers here. But as you can see, most of them were married, separated, divorced, or ex-cohabiting. So these were pretty established serious relationships. Next slide. And you can see that also with the length of relationship, which is at the bottom here. These were on average relationships that lasted 7 years. If they were no longer in those relationships, they ended on average 1.75 years ago. On average, the men were about 36 years of age. Their partners were 34 years of age. They had some sort of college education on average. Okay, next slide. Okay, so here's their victimization. I don't know which side to go to point to things. I don't have that one. Okay, thank you. Okay, so these first three are different types of emotional abuse. And this is their percentage of men who reported at least one of those acts. So we have 91% reported severe psychological abuse. So these are things like threats to harm the partner, someone he cares about, destroying something he cares about, things like that. 88.4% reported controlling behaviors. These are things like monitoring their partner's time or whereabouts, or isolating them from their family or friends, 77.6% reported threatened legal administrative abuse. So threats to falsely accuse him of domestic violence, threats to ruin his reputation at work or in the community. The next 4 bars are different levels of physical abuse. So we have 96.5% of the men reporting some kind of physical abuse. 85.5% was minor, 85.5% was severe physical abuse. So that's abuse that has a high likelihood of causing an injury, such as punching or slamming against a wall. Over here, we have 63.7% reporting very severe physical abuse. So that's abuse that could be life-threatening, such as beating up, using a knife or gun on your partner, choking them, or burning them on purpose. And then these last three are their reports of injury. So 81.4% reported an injury, 59% reported a severe injury. So that would be something that needs medical attention, like a broken bone or passing out from being hit on the head. Over here, this table here is the mean number of acts of each type of abuse. So typically in surveys, you do past year frequency, but we had the men report on any abusive relationship in their lifetime. So we just asked them yes, no for various types of abuse. So they could report up to 4 different types of severe psychologically abusive behaviors. They reported on average 2.6. They could report up to 10 different types of controlling behaviors. They reported on average 4.65. On down the line, I'm not going to go through all of them. They could report up to 12 physically abusive behaviors. They reported on average 6. They could report up to 6 different types of injuries, and they reported on average 2.5. So basically, this is sort of a proxy for how severe the abuse was. The more mean number of acts or the more varied the abuse is, the more severe it tends to be. So next slide, please. But what I really want to focus on is their help seeking, because that's one of the main impetuses for doing this study in the first place, was to get an updated idea of their help seeking. So we looked at 14 different sources of help. And you can see here, the most common place to seek help is a friend, followed by a mental health professional. So more than 50% of the men sought help from one of those 2 places, followed closely by a family member. About a third of the men sought help from the police, or a third from a legal professional. So this could be an attorney or the courts. About a third sought help from some sort of hotline or agency that focused on LGBTQ or male victims. Just under a third sought help from a medical professional. Just over a quarter sought help from an online resource specializing in DV against men or other men's issues. Under a quarter sought help from a mainstream DV hotline or agency. So just under a quarter. 17.8% sought help from a men's group. This actually was a very helpful source. The main reason men didn't seek help from them was because they didn't belong to one. 16.7% sought help from clergy or an indigenous leader or a cultural leader of some kind. The main reason for not going there was that they didn't belong to one of those groups. 16.3% sought help from a victim advocate. Main reason for not seeking help from there is they had no idea victim advocates existed. And then a minority of folks sought help from LGBTQ serving resources. And the main reason for not seeking help from there was that they didn't identify as LGBTQ. Next slide, please. So I want to talk a bit about why they didn't seek help from various sources. I am not going to go through all 14, but I'm going to just show a few highlights of why they weren't seeking help. And so to just sort of highlight the main reasons that tended to pop up again and again, I'm focusing on friends and family members. So the main reason they didn't seek help, which you see across the board, is embarrassment. That's always the main reason for not seeking help, embarrassment. Followed here by they didn't know how to tell them. Also, what pops up again and again in the data is that the incident was a private or personal matter. So we see that across resources. It's over there as well. Another thing that pops up again and again across resources is fear that it would bring dishonor or shame to the family. And we can see that over here And then also concerns that if they told this resource, others would find out. That's another big reason that we see again and again. We see over here that there's a fear that they'd be blamed. That's a big reason that pops up again and again. And also a fear that they wouldn't be believed is another reason that pops up again. Next slide, please. Now, I want to highlight these two resources here. These are reasons for not seeking help from either a mainstream domestic violence hotline or agency, or a hotline or agency focusing on men's or LGBTQ victimization. And again, number one reason is embarrassment, but if you could click the slide. One thing I wanted to highlight with this mainstream domestic violence hotline, and remember, less than a quarter of men sought help here. One of the main reasons was that they didn't think it was relevant to them because of their gender identity, or sexual orientation. Now, in the United States, domestic violence agencies are supposed to serve anybody, regardless of their demographics, including gender, yet the perception is they're not relevant. Next click, please. Second, another main reason is being biased. They're afraid that this agency will be biased against them. And we're going to see later on that there is, and we've seen before in the literature, that these are legitimate reasons. They're not just fears, that many men do experience this problem when they do reach out. And for hotline for men's or LGBTQ victimization, if you could click. The one main reason is they didn't know they existed. And we know this is a problem. And one of the problems is that there aren't that many of them, so they're hard to find. And the ones that exist are not well resourced, so it's hard to engage in a lot of outreach. So things to take, to think about in terms of figuring out how to solve this problem. You see repeated here also that they wouldn't believe me, they would blame me, and so forth is repeating again. Next slide, please. This I found really interesting. Why they didn't seek help from either the police or legal professionals. So legal professionals could be attorneys or court personnel or so forth. If you could click the. So the main reason is fear that their partner would falsely accuse them of domestic violence or some other illegal behavior. That is the main reason they're not going to either of those places, is this fear of being falsely accused. If you could click again and again. And two more times, thank you. I want to highlight first, also a big problem is fear of revenge by their partner. So fear that they're going to be falsely accused by their partner and fear of some other type of revenge by their partner as well. So not using the court systems or legal systems because of fears of what their partner is going to do to them. They also don't want to get their partner in trouble. That's another big reason. Okay, can you click again? One more time? Thank you. And then over here, they're not using the courts or legal professionals because of fear that they lose everything they ever worked for. So really interesting things to think about. We have seen this in the literature before, and it doesn't seem that things are changing all that much. Next slide, please. Okay. So now I want to focus on, of those who sought help, how helpful did they find their help seeking? And you can't see it up here, but this is an average rating of how helpful the different resources were. So 1 is not at all helpful. 5 is very helpful. So the higher, the better. 3, the anchor was neither helpful nor unhelpful. So if you score above a 3, you're on the helpfulness side. If you score below a 3, you're not on the helpfulness side. And so on the helpfulness side, we have all of these folks. LGBTQ support groups are very helpful. Only 7 people went there, so I don't know how stable that average is. But we're seeing men's groups, mental health professionals, online resources are very helpful. Helpful. I was also encouraged that friends, family members, clergy, Indigenous leaders, they're all helpful too, which means that they're able to overcome stereotypes about who's the true victim of domestic violence and actually provide some support to the men, which I found to be very encouraging. There's also some further online resources that are helpful. Medical professionals and DV agencies specific to men are helpful. Victim advocates are getting a little bit lower, but what is discouraging is that what's still on the unhelpfulness side are legal professionals, mainstream DV hotlines and agencies, and the police. Next slide, please. So this was very discouraging to me because, Emily and I were really hopeful that things had changed, and they're still being viewed as not very helpful. Only a minority of men are seeking help from DV agencies, less than a quarter. Often because of perceptions of biases and that they're not there for them, and that the men who go there are having problems. So here's just an example of some of the things that were problematic. The agencies didn't give them references to programs that helped or were specific to their needs. They didn't say that they did nothing to deserve the abuse. Only less than half of the agencies believed them. Over half said that they were told that they only help women. 42% were asked what they did to deserve the abuse. And just under 40% said their story was made light of or they were made fun of in some way. So that was very discouraging to us, showing Emily and me that we've only really scratched the surface with the outreach that we've been doing in terms of training DV agencies. There's a lot more work to do. Next slide, please. In terms of legal professionals, I'm not going to get too much into detail here, but essentially legal professionals weren't providing the information or support that the men wanted. But at least they were being believed for the most part and not being asked what they did to deserve the abuse or not being made fun of in any way, but not being supported at all. Next slide, please. And in terms of the police, let's see, is there a way to move that little black box there? Thank you. Okay, so the arrest data. So we don't see too much change in what's happening in terms of arrest. 43% said their partner was arrested, 33% said they were arrested, 9.7% both were arrested. The police weren't providing them with any sort of support services or resources. And 42.1% said that the police did make light of their story and made fun of them in some way. Next slide, please. So what do we conclude? So similar to our 2007 study, we are seeing that men are seeking help from family, friends, and mental health professionals the most, and these are the most helpful. We are also seeing that men aren't seeking help from mainstream DV hotlines. And we're finding that it's because the men don't think that this is for them. These are also still not very helpful, along with the police, in helping them to overcome their abuse, even though DV agencies and the police are sort of our frontline service system for domestic violence victims. They're not helpful to male victims. So some new information, DV hotline specific to male and LGBTQ victims. About a third of men are seeking help from them and finding them helpful. And those who don't just don't know they exist. And we are seeing that online resources and men's groups are very helpful. So it's another avenue to reach men. Next slide. And they're not seeking help because of embarrassment. It's a private, personal matter. It can bring shame on the family, concerns others will find out, and fears of not being believed or being blamed. And these are things that we need to consider when thinking about outreaching to men to find help. And then a bigger problem is that men aren't seeking help from legal professional resources because of fear of false allegations and fear of revenge by their partner and not wanting to get their partner in trouble with the law in courts. And I think this is going to be a tougher one to overcome. Next slide, please. So implications. We need more, I don't know how many times in 20 years I can say this, but we need more inclusive laws and policies, right, that are inclusive of gender. So in the United States, we have the Violence Against Women Act. And apologists say, well, it says right in there that they're supposed to help men, but it's still called the Violence Against Women Act. And we need to move away from the terms violence against women and gender-based violence, because this violence is not just about gender. right? And particularly when you start looking at LGBTQ relationships, this is not just about gender. There's more going on here. We need better training of law enforcement and legal professionals. This is going to be a challenge because most of these folks get trained by the domestic violence agencies who are still operating under patriarchal theory. But these folks need to know the various ways that domestic violence can manifest so that they're providing better help and services and resources to the men. And Bijan, am I allowed to say what Sasha and I are working on? Okay, so Sasha and I are working with the Canadian Center for Men and Families on a law enforcement training for police on male victims of domestic violence that hopefully they can get to be very widespread. We're almost done. So we'll see whether we can, thank you. And then hopefully we can break into the courts and so forth as well, which I've been wanting to do for a long time. Next slide, please. And then we need more gender inclusive outreach to the general public so that more people, so that my students aren't surprised every time I teach this. They're still surprised. So more gender inclusive outreach and gender specific outreach too, so that people can see the various faces of victims of domestic violence and the various ways it can manifest. And then Emily and I really need to get out there to more DV agencies because what we've been doing is not enough. Things have not moved all that much since 2007, according to the data that men are saying in terms of the help they're receiving. So they need better job being trained and they need to do a better job of outreaching to male victims. I've seen some pretty poor outreach by DV agencies for male victims. It's not encouraging them to come. Even though I think they're trying, they need a little bit more consultation on how to better outreach. And more visibility for the DV agencies out there. They're doing such a great job of focusing on male victims and LGBTQ victims. We need more visibility of them somehow, some way, more resources to them and more of them. Because I know from assessing LGBTQ victims in particular, those are the places they feel comfortable going. Is some place that understands them. And I suspect that male victims feel the same way, heterosexual male victims. Next slide, please. So I'd like to end with this chart, which is a chart I put together, and I'm hoping it's not inclusive, but it's all the places around the world where I'm seeing domestic violence research against men being conducted. So one splotch for each country, one purple splotch for each country. So I've seen publications, or someone here is presenting this weekend, or there's a government publication, or someone from that country has outreached me and said, hey, I'm doing a study. So this is also some good news, that there's research being done around the world on male victims of domestic violence. 30 years ago, you would not have seen this map. So you are all doing such a wonderful job helping these men. And next slide. So with that, if there's time, I know we're running behind, I'll take your questions. Thank you.